Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Pierce and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1971 and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this spring, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of Blind Owl available over at the register, and please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things, so now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Sassan Tabatabai and Sunil Sharma, here to discuss and celebrate the release of Sassan's new translation of Blind Owl by Sadeq Hedayat, one of the most important Iranian novels of the 20th century. Sassan Tabatabai was born in Tehran in 1967 and has been living in the United States since 1980. He is a poet, a translator, and a scholar of medieval Persian literature. He is master lecturer in world languages and literatures and the core curriculum, and coordinator of the Persian language program at Boston University. Sassan is the author of Father of Persian Verse, Rudakai and his poetry, Sufi haiku, and another collection of poetry, Uzu Boran. Thank you, much better. His forthcoming books, both scheduled for release this spring, are Ferry to Malta, Poems and Translations, and a Persian translation of the poetry of David Ferry. And tonight's moderator, Sunil Sharma, teaches Persian and South Asian literature in the Department of World Languages and Literatures at Boston University. His areas of research are poetry and court cultures, history of the book, and travel writing. Apart from research articles and books, he has also published translations. In the Bazaar of Love includes his translations from the Persian and medieval Hindi poetry of the iconic poet Amir Khusraw, and he has also translated travelogues written by Iranian and Indian women, which appear in the recently published anthology, 3 Centuries of Travel Writing by Muslim Women, and he aspires to write historical fiction someday. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation, and now Sassan and Sunil.
Since we're here to listen to and celebrate Sassan's translation, I'm actually going to give it over to him right away. Sassan, why don't you introduce very briefly the author Sadeq Hedayat for us to provide a bit of a context for the novel and then read for us, so then we can talk about it once we hear about what the novel is like. Sorry.
Hello.
There we go.
Thank you, Piers. Thank you, Sam. On April 9th, 1951, the police in Paris were called to a small apartment at number 37 Rue des Championnats. There they found the dead body of a man who had apparently died of suicide by gas inhalation. He had put towels underneath the door and was lying in the middle of the kitchen on a blanket. He was later identified as Sadeq Hedayat, 48 years old. Hedayat is considered one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, Iranian novelists of the 20th century. He is credited with bringing Iranian modernist literature onto the international scene. Hedayat was born in Tehran in 1903. He was born to a prominent aristocratic family and was educated in a French school in Iran. In 1925, he received a scholarship to continue his education in France. 5 years later, he moved back without having acquired a degree, and it is thought that right around that time, in 1930, he starts writing what would become his greatest work, The Blind Owl. In 1936, he moved to India, and he published Blind Owl. It was a handwritten volume um, he made 50 mimeographed copies of it, and was meant for distribution to friends and family alone. It had original illustrations as well. This is what later became known as the Bombay edition. He returned to Paris in 1951, where he took his own life. Blind Owl is unfolds as a story. It's a very odd story. It unfolds in two main parts, separated by one transitional link that link the two parts together. And I'm going to tell you the story of Blind Owl. I'm just going to stitch parts together, and hopefully the story will speak for itself. And this is how it starts. در زندگی زخمایی هست که مثل خوره روح را آهسته در انزوا می‌خورد. In life there are wounds that like termites slowly bore into and eat away at the isolated soul. You can't tell anyone about these pains. People think of them as strange and unnatural, and if you try to talk or write about them, they fall back on their same worn beliefs and dismiss them with a mocking smile. That's because man has not yet found any solution, any drug that can cure them. The only cure can be found in the amnesia brought on by wine and the artificial sleep of opium. But alas, these remedies are short-lived, and instead of relief, after a short time, they only add to the pain. One day will someone be able to discover the secret to these supernatural events, when the shadow of the soul languishes in the purgatory between sleep and wakefulness. I will only describe one of these events that happened to me and shook me so violently, I will never forget it. It has poisoned my life, and I will carry its cursed mark on me to the end of my days. Did I say poison? I meant to say it is a grief from which I've always suffered and always will. I will try to write down everything I remember from the chain of events. Maybe I will be able to make sense of them and actually believe them myself. It makes no difference to me if others believe me or not. The only thing that scares me is that I will die tomorrow without having known myself. In life, I have encountered a dark abyss that separates me from others. I understand that as much as possible, I must remain extinguished and keep my thoughts to myself. And if I have decided to write them down now, it is only to introduce myself to my shadow, which is hunched over on the wall and swallows everything I write with a voracious appetite. It is for him that I want to conduct an experiment. Maybe we can get to know each other. Since I've cut off my ties with everyone else, I want to get to know myself better. Now, our unnamed narrator lives alone, lives a completely isolated life on the outskirts of an unnamed city. And all he does is he paints pancake sculptures. That's his job. The odd thing is that I don't know why I always painted the same exact scene on the pen cases. They were exactly the same. I always drew a cypress tree with a hunched old man sitting underneath. He was wrapped in a cape like an Indian yogi and wore a turban on his head. He had the index finger of his left hand on his lips in a gesture of surprise. In front of him, a girl wearing a long black dress was bending down to offer him a water lily. A gentle stream flowed between them. Had I seen this scene before? Was it a vision from a dream? I don't know. All I know is that I always painted the same exact scene, as if I had no control over my hand. What's even more strange is that there were always customers for my pen cases. I would even ship them to my uncle in India, who would sell them and send me the money. Now, one day he gets an unexpected visitor, and it's his uncle who shows up. His uncle is an old man wearing a cape and a turban on his head. We bore a distant, laughable resemblance to each other, as if my fevered image had been projected on a distorting mirror. I had always imagined that this is what my father would have looked like. As soon as he came in, he went to the corner of the room and crouched. I figured I should offer him something. I went into the dark pantry and looked in every corner to see if I could find something to offer him, even though I knew I had nothing. No wine, no opium. Suddenly my eyes caught a flask on the shelf. It was like a revelation. It was an old fat flask of aged wine I had inherited. Apparently, it was bottled on the same day I was born. It was right there on the shelf. It had never crossed my mind. I had completely forgotten that there was such a thing in the house. I pulled over the stool and stepped up to reach the shelf. But as I reached to take the flask, I caught sight of the outside world through the small opening over the shelf. In the field behind my place, I saw a hunched old man sitting under a cypress tree with a young woman. No, a celestial angel. In front of him, bending down to offer him a purple water lily with her right hand. The old man was chewing the index finger with his left hand. The girl was right in front of me, but seemed completely aware of her surroundings. She was looking without seeing. A frozen half smile curled her lip, as if she were thinking of someone absent. That's when I saw her frightening, hypnotic eyes. They seemed angry, scolding. They were anxious, curious, and threatening. I felt my life force dissolve in those radiant, defining globes and get sucked into their depths. As much as the human mind can conceive, this seductive mirror drew my entire being towards itself. Her slanted turban eyes were intoxicating, unearthly. They were frightening and seductive at the same time, as if they had witnessed horrifying, supernatural scenes that others can't see. She had prominent cheekbones, a long forehead, thin eyebrows that reached each other, and fleshy half-open lips. Lips that looked as if they had just separated from a long, passionate kiss, but remained insatiate. Her black disheveled hair fell casually around her moon-like face. One strand was glued to her temple. Her soft features, her ethereal figure, and carefree movement spoke of her fleeting, shadowy beauty. Sorry. It's the Persian hospitality. She was wearing a black pleated dress that clung to her body like a mold. As I looked, it seemed as if she wanted to jump over the screen that separated her and the old man, but couldn't. Then the old man started to laugh. It was a dry, disturbing laugh that made the hair of her body stand on end. It was a hard, mocking laugh that made the hair of your body stand on end. Oh, I'm sorry, I read that. It was a hard, mocking laugh, but his face never changed. It seemed to echo out of some abyss. Terrified, I jumped off the stool with a flask of wine in my hand. I don't know why I was shaking. It was a kind of tremor, full of fear and desire, as if I had just woken from a vivid night. I put the flask of wine on the floor and held my head in my hands. How many minutes, how many hours did I stay like that? I don't know. As soon as I came to, I picked up the flask of wine and went into the room. I saw that my uncle was gone, and I'd left the door open a crack, like the mouth of a cadaver. But the dry laugh of the old man still rang in my ears. I thought about this all night. A few times I was tempted to go and look through the opening in the wall, but I was afraid of the old man's laughter. The next day I was still thinking about this. Could I totally close my eyes to having seen her? The next day, with 1,000 trepidations, I decided to put the flask of wine back in its place. But as soon as I pulled aside the curtain to the pantry, I saw a black wall in front of me, like the blackness that had consumed my entire life. In fact, there was no opening to the outside. The opening in the corner was completely seen and had become part of the wall, as if it had never been there in the first place. Now, this sets our narrator on the path to delirium. Every day he roams around his neighborhood, trying to find that cypress tree, that stream of water, and the people he had seen there. On that last night, I went for a walk like other nights. It was drizzling and a thick fog blanketed everything. In rainy weather, when the brightness is stripped of colors and the impropriety is removed from the silhouettes of objects, I could feel calm and free. I could feel calm and free. As if the rain were washing away my dark thoughts. On that night, the thing that should not have happened, happened. I was prowling aimlessly, but during those hours of solitude, these minutes that I had lost track of, her fading face, as if peeking through cloud or smoke, a face without movement or expression, like the paintings on pen case covers, appeared before me. When I returned, I think much of the night had passed, and the thick fog had settled, so that I could barely see in front of my feet. But I felt an unusual sentience boiling up inside me. When I reached the door, I could sense a body dressed in black, a woman's body, sitting on the front stoop of my house. I turned the key and the door opened. I moved to the side. She got up and walked through the dark entrance like someone who knows the way. She opened the door and I walked in behind her. With shaking hands, I lit the lamp. I saw that she had gone to my bed and was lying down. Her face was in the shadow. I don't know if she could see me or not, hear me or not. Apparently she was neither scared, nor had she the desire to resist. It was as if she had not come of her own will. I bent down to see her better because her eyes were closed. But the more I looked at her, the more distant she seemed. Suddenly I realized I knew nothing of the secrets of her heart. There was no connection between us. I wanted to say something, but was afraid that her ears, her sensitive ears that must have been accustomed to soft, celestial music, would be disgusted by my voice. It occurred to me that she might be hungry or thirsty. I went into the pantry of my room to find something for her, even though I knew I had nothing in the house. But it was like a revelation. On the top shelf, I had a flask of aged wine I had inherited from my father. I brought the stool and took down the flask of wine. I tiptoed next to the bed. I saw that she was sleeping like a tired, worn-out child. She was completely asleep, and her long eyelashes rested on each other like velvet. I opened the flask and gently poured a cup of wine into her mouth through her clenched teeth. I brought my chair next to the bed and stared at her face. What a childlike face. What an odd expression. I don't know why I reached out. I had no control over my hand and touched her curls, curls that were always glued to her temples. Then I ran my fingers through her hair. It was cold and moist. Cold. Completely cold. As if she had been dead for days. I wasn't mistaken. She was dead. I reached to the front of her dress and put my hand on her breast and heart. There wasn't the slightest beat. I brought the mirror and held it in front of her nose, but there wasn't the slightest sign of life in her. I wanted to warm her with the heat of my own body, give her my warmth, and take the coldness of death from her. Maybe this way I could breathe my own soul into her body. I took off my clothes and lay next to her on the bed. We clung to each other like the male and female of the mandrake. Her body was just like the body of the female mandrake that's been ripped from the embrace of her mate and had the same burning love of the mandrake. Her mouth had a bitter, acrid taste, like the butt end of a cucumber. Her whole body was as cold as hail. I felt the cold penetrate to the depths of my heart and freeze the blood in my arteries. All my efforts were in vain. I got off the bed and put on my clothes. No, it was no lie. She had come into my room, my bed, and surrendered her body and her soul. She gave both to me. While she was alive, while her eyes were still full of life, only the memory of her eyes tortured me. But now, senseless, motionless, cold, and with closed eyes, she surrendered herself to me with closed eyes. Now, the narrator is overwhelmed with the need to sketch her face on paper. But he has a really hard time doing this because her eyes are closed and he can't get the expression of her eyes down on paper. Until close to dawn, I don't know how many times I sketched her face, but I shredded them all. I neither got tired of this, nor did I sense the time go by. It was twilight, and a hushed glow seeped into my room through the window. I was busy with a sketch that I thought was better than the others, but her eyes that seemed to scold as if I had committed an inexcusable sin. I could not bring those eyes down on paper. Then in that moment, the substance, the look of those eyes disappeared from my memory. My efforts were in vain. And as much as I stared at her face, I couldn't remember their expression. Suddenly, I noticed a hint of color creeping back into her cheeks. It was a red color of liver, the color of the meat that hangs outside the butcher shop. She had come to life. Her immeasurably open and surprised eyes, eyes that brimmed with the luster of life, but glowed with an unhealthy light. Her afflicted, scolding eyes slowly opened and stared at my face. It was the first time she had noticed me. She looked at me and then her eyes closed again. This took no more than an instant, but it lasted long enough for me to grasp the essence of her eyes and sketch them on paper. I drew them with the tip of my pen, but this time I didn't tear the paper. Well, now the narrator is in a room with a corpse and deliberates on what to do with the body. So he decides to take her out and bury her. But the problem is she's too big. So he takes a bone-handled knife that he has in his pantry and he dismembers her and he puts her in a suitcase. Should that for a while. I locked the lid of the suitcase, put the key in my pocket and breathed a sigh of relief. I weighed the suitcase, it was heavy. I had never felt so tired before. No, I would never be able to carry the suitcase by myself. The sky clouded over again, and it started to drizzle. I left my room. Maybe I could find someone to help me with the suitcase. There was no one in sight. But I looked closely, and a little further away, through the fog, I saw a hunched old man sitting under a cypress tree. You could not see his face, which was wrapped in a wide scarf. I slowly went near. I hadn't said a thing when the old man burst into a dry and disturbing laugh, a laugh of a half-breed that made the hair of my body stand on end. And said, "If you want porter, I'm ready, huh? I have hearse wagon too. Every day I take corpse to Shop de Lazim and bury there, huh? I make coffin too. I can make for any size. They are always right size. I am ready, huh? Right now." He laughed so hard his shoulders shook. I motioned with my hand towards my house, but he didn't give me a chance to talk. "Not necessary. I know your house. Right now, huh?" He got up from his seat. I started back towards my house, went into the room, and with great effort, dragged the suitcase to the door. I saw an old, dilapidated hearse wagon by the door. It was tied to two emaciated black nags that looked like corpses. The The hunched old man was sitting at the helm, holding a long whip in his hand, but he never turned around to look at me. With great effort, I lifted the suitcase into the wagon and saw a niche carved out for a coffin. I climbed up and lay inside the niche and placed my head on the ledge so I could see out. Then I slid the suitcase on my chest and held it tight with both hands. The whip cracked in the air and the horses set off, panting. You could see their breath, which came out of their nostrils like smoke columns in the rain. They took long, gentle strides. Their thin legs trod the ground gingerly, soundlessly, like thieves who, according to the law, have had their fingers amputated and the stumps dumped in hot oil. The bells around their necks sang a peculiar melody. An inexplicable sense of comfort inundated me, to the extent that I didn't feel the movement of the hearse wagon. I could only feel the weight of the suitcase on my ribcage. Now, in one of the most surreal passages in this book, he buries the suitcase with the help of the grave digger. Yeah, you guessed it. Under a cypress tree, next to a stream with purple water lilies growing on the bank. And while digging, the grave digger unearths this antique vase, or jug, and which he wraps in a piece of filthy cloth, and then leaves. The narrator starts to wander home. It gets dark and he loses his way in the fog. He sits by the side of the road and then suddenly realizes that there's someone sitting right next to him. And it's the grave digger. There's my grave digger. You probably wanted to go to town but lost the way, huh? You probably ask yourself what I'm doing in the graveyard this time of night. But don't be feared. My business is only with the dead. My job is digging graves. It's not a bad job, huh? I know all the paths and ditches here. For example, today I went to dig grave and found this vase under the dirt. You know it's from Ragis. It's from old city of Ray, huh? It's really nothing. I give this jug for you, for you to remember me. He put the earthen jug in my lap and got up. He laughed so hard his shoulders shook. I took the earthen jug and started to follow the hunched figure of the old man. Around the bend in the road there stood a decrepit hearse wagon with two emaciated black nags. The old man climbed onto the seat with unusual nimbleness. I went in and lay down inside the special niche built for a casket and rested my head on the ledge so I could see around me. I placed the earthen jug on my chest and held it in my hands. The whip cracked in the air and the horses set off, panting. They took long, gentle strides. Their long legs trod the ground gingerly, silently. In the misty air, the bells around their necks sang a peculiar melody. From behind the clouds, the stars looked down upon the earth like bright eyes bulging out of their sockets in a pool of black, coagulated blood. A delightful calm covered me from head to toe. Only the weight of the vase, like a dead body, pressed on my chest. Now, the narrator goes back into his room. He unwraps the jug that the gravedigger gave him, and he looks at it. It had a violet glaze, ancient and clear, the color of ground golden bee flies. On one side, purple water lilies lined an almond-shaped frame, and the middle of that, inside the almond-shaped frame, was a drawing of her face, the face of a woman with large black eyes, larger than usual. They were scolding eyes, as if I had committed unforgivable sins I did not know about. They were frightening, bewitching eyes, at the same time restless and surprised, threatening and seductive. The eyes frightened and seduced, and then intoxicating, supernatural glow burned at their core. She had prominent cheekbones, long forehead, thin eyebrows that reached each other, fleshy, half-open lips, and disheveled hair, with one strand glued to her temple. I took out the portrait I had sketched the night before from the tin can and compared it to the image on the earthen jug. There was no difference, as if they were copies of each other. Both were the same. In fact, both were the work of the same person, a pathetic painter of pen case covers. Maybe the soul of the painter of the earthen jug had penetrated me when I was painting, and my hand was under his control. Now, the first part of the story comes to an end. With the narrator back in his own room, he smokes all the opium he has left, and then drifts off into an opium dream. Now there's a very short link. It's a half-page transitional link that links this very strange first part to the second part of the story. This is the link. I woke up in a new world, but it all seemed very familiar to me. So familiar that I felt a stronger attachment to it than to my old life, as if it were a reflection of my real existence. It was a different world, but seemed closer and more pertinent, as if I had returned to my original environment. I had been reborn into an ancient world, but one closer and more natural. It was still twilight. The light from a tallow burning lamp was flickering from the shelf in my room. There was a mattress in the corner, but I was awake. My body felt hot, and there were blood stains on my cloak and scarf, and my hands were covered in blood. But even with the fever and dizziness, I felt an odd excitement, stronger than the thought of getting rid of the blood stains, stronger than the fear of being arrested by the sheriff. In any case, I had expected to fall into the hands of the sheriff for some time now, but planned to down a whole cup of the poisoned wine before being arrested. The need to write had become an obsession, a duty. I wanted to expel the demon that had been raking at my entrails for so long. I wanted to broadcast my bravery by putting it all down on paper. Finally, after some moments of hesitation, I drew the tallow burning lamp near and started like this. So the second part of the story opens with quotation marks that don't close until the very end of the story. A reminder to us, the reader, that what we are reading now is actually a testament written by the narrator himself. It's not really clear if the second part of the story constitutes an actual movement back in time and offers maybe a different window into the same reality, into a previous incarnation, or it's a confessional recollection of the hallucinatory world that we encounter in the first part, a world that's fueled by opium. Nevertheless, the narrative that unfolds in the second part provides the disturbing perspective supported by all kinds of clues that eventually unlocks the mysteries to the enigmatic accounts of the first part. So as the story unfolds in the second part, the reader slowly puts together the pieces that explain all the strange things going on in the first part. The mystery about the poisoned wine, the story about his parents, and ultimately the very disturbing reality of the ethereal woman opening her eyes after she's already dead. And there's a number of objects that create bridges between the first and the second part. There's the earthen jug, there's the bone-handled knife, and ultimately it's the characters themselves. Now, throughout the second part, emanations of the two archetypal characters on the pen case that he's been drawing on the pen case. The man, the old man with the sinister laugh, and the ethereal woman, they appear through repetitive turns of phrase that really draw the reader into the very unstable psyche of the narrator. second part, we learn that he doesn't live alone. In fact, he lives with his old wet nurse and his unfaithful wife, which he calls the slut, who is also his first cousin. And they live in the city of Rain. And he suffers from some kind of ailment, and he rarely leaves his room, which has become like a coffin for him. From the window of his room, he can see a butcher shop and an old peddler selling all kinds of oddments. And as the story progresses, he becomes increasingly obsessed with the butcher and the peddler. Right? And echoing the opening sentence of the book, these two characters infiltrate the narrator's psyche like termites and slowly eat away at him from the inside. In my room, there's a mirror on the wall in which I see my own face. In my cramped life, this mirror is more important than the world of the vulgar, which has nothing to do with me. From all the scenes in this city, the one in front of the opening in my room is of a humble butcher shop that consumes 2 sheep every day. When I look out, I see the butcher. Every morning, 2 emaciated black nags, consumptive nags with a deep, dry cough and stiff legs that terminate in hooves, as if they had been amputated according to some primitive law and dunked in hot oil, carry the carcasses of 4 sheep to the shop. The butcher rubs his greasy hands on his hennaed beard. First he looks the carcasses up and down with the eyes of a buyer, chooses 2 of them, and weighs the tail fat with his hand. Then hangs them on a hook outside his shop. The horses set up, panting. Then the butcher caresses the bloody corpses with their cut throats, their bulging eyes, and blood-stained eyelids that protrude from their bruised skulls. He feels them up. Then he takes a bone-handled knife and cuts them up very carefully and sells the meat to his customers with a smile. He does everything with such delight. I'm sure he gets immense pleasure out of it. That yellow dog with a thick neck, which has staked out our neighborhood. The one with the bent head and innocent eyes stares at the butcher's hands with envy. The dog also knows all this. He knows that the butcher enjoys his job. A little further, a strange old man sits under an awning with all kinds of wares laid out in front of him. On a spread, there's a sickle, 2 horseshoes, a few colorful beads, a knife, a mousetrap, a rusty pair of pliers, a bottle of ink, a comb with broken teeth, a small shovel, and a glazed earthen jug, which he has covered with a piece of filthy cloth. I've watched him for hours, days, months. He sits there always in the same position, with his dirty scarf, his camel-covered cloak, his open collar through which his white chest hair sticks out, his afflicted eyelids that swallow the malady and impropriety of his stubborn look, and the talisman tied around his arm. On Friday nights, with his yellowed, half-broken teeth, he recites the Quran. Apparently that's how he makes his living, because I never see anyone buy anything from him. His face is the face I usually see in my nightmares. I wonder what stubborn and stupid thoughts, like foul weeds, run through his round, shaved head, his short forehead wrapped inside the cream-colored turban. Apparently, the spread in front of the old man and all the junk on it has a special relation to his life. A couple of times, I decided to go and talk to him or buy something from him, but I didn't have the courage. My wet nurse told me that the man was a potter in his youth and had only kept that one earthen jug for himself. Now he makes his living by peddling. And we also learn about the family, the story about his family, and the story behind the poison wine. This is my favorite. My father and uncle were twins. were twin brothers. They looked identical. They acted the same. Even their voices sounded the same, to the point that it was difficult to tell them apart. They even had a spiritual connection, a mutual physical empathy, where if one got sick, the other would get sick as well. They were, as the expression goes, two halves of an apple. Finally, they both took up trade, and at the age of 20, moved to India, where they would import and sell handicrafts from Ray. Things like different kinds of cloth, cotton cloths with ornate stitching, cloths with flower prints, boxes, scarves, needles, earthen dishes, shampoo, and pen cases. My father was stationed at their base in Benares, and my uncle would travel to other cities and sell their goods. After a while, my father fell in love with the Virgin, Bugamdasi, who was a temple dancer of Lingam Puja. Her job was to dance in front of the great statue of Lingam and attend to it. She was a warm-blooded girl with olive skin, lemon breasts, large slanted eyes, and thin connecting eyebrows, with a red dot in the middle. I had just been born when my uncle returned to Benares from one of his trips. Apparently my uncle, whose tastes and desires were just like my father's, fell head over heels in love with my mother. Finally, he tricked her. An easy task considering the physical and spiritual similarities between him and my father. But soon, my mother discovered their trick and threatened to leave them both unless they agreed to take the test of the cook. She would belong to the one who survived. The test was like this. My father and uncle would be locked inside a dark room like a dungeon with a cobra. Whoever was bitten would naturally scream, at which point the snake charmer would open the door and rescue the other one, and Bugamdasi would belong to him. Before they were thrown into the dungeon, my father asked Bugamdasi to dance for him one more time, to dance the sacred dance of the temple. Bugamdasi agreed, and danced in torchlight to the song of the snake charmer's flute, with smooth, rhythmic movements that were full of meaning, with the twists and sways of a cobra. Then they locked my father and uncle into the room with the cobra. But instead of a scream of fear, there arose an odd moan mixed with a disturbing laugh, and then a hideous scream. When they opened the door, it was my uncle who came out, but his face had turned old and broken. My uncle emerged from the horror in that room, the sound of the slithering, hissing snake, its round glowing eyes, its poisonous fangs and black body, its long head and large head, wide like a ladle, with white hair. According to the deal, Bugamdasi now belonged to my uncle, but the terrible thing was that it was not clear who had survived the trial, my father or my uncle. The trial had deranged the survivor. He completely forgot his old life and did not recognize the baby. That is why they thought he was my uncle. Is the story not pertinent to my life? Has the echo of this disturbing laugh, the horror of this trial, not left its mark on me? After that, I was nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. Finally, my uncle, or my father, and Bugamdasi returned to Ray for business and entrusted me to his sister, my aunt. My wet nurse said that when they were saying goodbye, my mother gave a flask of wine to my aunt. It was wine mixed with the venom of the cobra. What better thing could Bugamdasi had left as a keepsake for her child? This violet wine, this elixir of death that could grant eternal peace. Maybe she had also crushed her life like a bunch of grapes and left the wine to me. This was the same venom that had killed my father. Now I realized what a valuable gift she had given me. I'm gonna stop reading that because the rest of the story is too exciting for me to go.
to ask you some questions, and then I'm sure the audience also has a lot of questions. That was heavy and breathtaking. I mean, every time I hear you read or I read the novel in the original, the translation, it's just amazing. And this is something, so it always comes to my mind. Persian literature is known for its rich tradition of Sufi poetry and heroic verse, the Shahnameh, and this is so different from all that. Is it related in any way to the classical tradition? We see some images here and there that were familiar. Yeah.
You see that the images we see very similar to when he sees the uncle, and he thinks he looks like the uncle, but reflected in a distorting mirror, right? This is a reflection of the distorting mirror we see in the classics, right? So the scene he paints on the pen case cover, the man sitting under a cypress tree, the woman bending down to offer him a water lily, that is right out of classical Persian literature, right? So you get any copy of, I don't know, for example, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, you're gonna get some kind of, some variation of this very same scene on the cover. But typically, the old man is a wise dervish, right? He is the repository of some kind of Gnostic knowledge, right? And he turns that on its head, and this is what makes this particular, makes it a modern novel. He turns that on its head, right? So the old wise man, the old wise Sufi becomes this deranged old man with a sinister laugh that makes the hair of your body stand on end. The woman who is offering him a water lily, I mean, she's basically, from a classical sense, she's the embodiment of the Sali, right? The beloved. Yeah. She's the beloved who is offering, typically offers the wise dervish a cup of Gnostic wine, right? That's what's particularly novel about this. He flips the whole thing on its head, and yeah.
Yeah. So at this time in Iran, there were a lot of exciting things happening politically, socially, and on the literary scene too. There's new kind of poetry being written and novels. I mean, where does Sadeq Hedayat come out from? What is he reading? Where does he get his inspiration? What is he trying to do with this novel?
Well, he is very steeped in the Western tradition, right? So the influences we see on Hedayat is it's Dostoevsky, right? It's Dostoevsky, it's Kafka, it's Poe. That's the kind of very odd, dark, psychological literature that we get, and from all accounts, he was very much interested in that. He was well read in it. He translated some of it into Persian, and yeah. So what we get with this guy is something that is very typical in Russian literature, right? You have the character suffering from brain fever, right? That's something you only find in Russian literature. It's Raskolnikov
from Underground.
From Crime and Punishment. The weird character stuck inside his own head, and in turn stuck inside his own room, that gets consumed by his own thoughts.
Right. And I know some of his contemporaries thought he was deranged, and this novel was just kind of, the outpourings of a madman. But how did it sort of become a classic or a masterpiece of modern Persian literature?
Well, it kind of initiates Persian modernism, Iranian modernist literature, right? It's groundbreaking, right? And there had been nothing like this before, right? So we have 1,000-year tradition of Persian literature, and it's all exactly what you said before, right? It's that wonderfully, I don't know, spiritual, sophistic, themes that we get, and suddenly we get, with Hedayat, and it's something that appeals to the mid 19th century, 20th century audience, the readers, right? It was translated into French, I think it was soon after it came out, like in the 1940s, and it was a great hit, you know? And so, yeah, suddenly it's, you know, on the international scene, people are reading non-classical Persian literature.
And I remember recently one of our friends told us that he was in Iran in the 70s, and all the young students and college students were reading this novel, and then suddenly it was banned, right?
It was banned, yeah.
Yeah. So
Even before it was banned, it was censored.
Yeah.
It was censored. So this, sorry, may I?
Yes. I brought
So this
up.
is that Sunil got. So I mean, just as a side note, for my translation, this had come out in serialized form, censored. Different editions came out, censored, and then until it was completely banned. So the only authentic text is that Bombay edition, which is the handwritten manuscript. And that's what I used to translate. And someone asked me, how did you get your hands on the handwritten manuscript? I said, Amazon.
It's a facsimile.
It's a facsimile, right? So you can actually buy this on Amazon.
Well, it doesn't look like the autograph copy of a madman. I mean, it's very meticulously
done. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and considering how, you know, you
Right.
can do backspace and delete.
Right.
So chances are, whatever he made mistakes, he started that page from the beginning.
Right. And this is always sort of a dangerous question.
Oh.
Is Hedayat the narrator in any way? Or tell us about the narrator. You said there are these two parts to the book, but I've always had trouble connecting them. You know, we've had various conversations about this. What's your latest?
My latest?
Yes.
I love that. What's your latest? Because it changes all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, the more you read this, the more you change your mind about what's
Yeah.
happening. The narrator is not Hedayat,
Mhm.
right? It's like saying, you know, it's Shakespeare, the narrator of the sonnets. It's like, no, the narrator is the narrator, it's not Shakespeare. But the character himself is very odd. And you're right, it's very difficult to kind of connect the two parts, right? So the way we typically read this is you read it through, and once you're done, you really should go back and read the first part again, because that's when things start to make sense. It's this very odd circular book, right? After the book ends, there's a very small, like half a page, I don't know, you can't call it a link because it's not linking it to anything else, but in a way it's linking it back to the beginning of the book, that it urges you to read this. It's very circular in that way. And you can't tell, so some people say the second part is a movement back in time. And we are getting a look at two different incarnations, right? But there's, another way to look at it is that the second part is just a more realistic, confessional account of that really strange, hallucinatory world that happened in the first part.
And when you read it, it reads really beautifully. What about the original Persian? You read a few lines first in the beginning. What's the quality like? Is it the sentences are very long?
It's very long.
and-
God, the sentences.
Yeah.
Some of the sentences go on forever. It's actually very conversational. Believe it or not, the tone is that I tried to carry that over in the translation. So it's not the lofty intellectual kind of, I don't know, Sartrean French existentialist things that you would expect from a writer who lived in France,
Yeah.
right? It's conversational. The characters provincial, right? That there is no talk about his education, absolutely whatsoever. So,
Yeah, and can you, I'm always curious about sort of the act of translation and your role as a translator. You've done both translation and you're a poet as well. How did you work on this? Did you work just sort of continuously because it's a novella? Did you just translate it, or would you go back to parts of it?
You constantly go back to parts, right? It is the process of revision. I mean, it's a good thing you got published. If it wasn't published, I'd still be revising. How long did it take? That's okay. I worked on it in spurts, by the way, right? So overall, it took around 2 years, right? But again, in spurts, you know. And it's such a weird book that you kind of have to put it aside for a while, right? Sometimes you put it aside, you kind of regroup mentally, right? Get your wits about you, and then start translating it.
Did you have to do a lot of research in the sort of the background of there was some strange vocabulary.
Oh yes. Well, the vocabulary. Yeah. Some of the vocabulary was strange, yes. But you know, as far as the research was just just basically textual archaeology. That's about it. But yeah, there were some strange words that he did. What do you do with this? And I remember we had all kinds of conversations about this, right? It's like, I can't find anything in Dekhwala. It's like, oh my God, what are we going to do with this word? So, yeah, there was.
I understand your students also were involved in
That's right.
this with you.
That's right. Shout out to my students. we read this together. We decided to write it in then we read it in English, but we tried to read this in Persian, and we're like, all right, we're gonna read this thing in a semester, and we ended up maybe getting 15 pages through the whole thing, something like that. It's quite dense to be tackled.
So let's open it up to the audience for questions. I'm sure you all have.
Could you give us an example of one of those words that were strange that you translated?
Okay. There was a word which actually, so I was using the handwritten manuscripts also typed up, right? Just a transcript of it, which makes it a lot easier to read, but the handwriting is sometimes difficult to figure out. So we came across this word. It was do, right? The letter do, and then lache, and we couldn't figure out. It's like lache, leche, just do is the number 2, lache, yes. So, and then I looked in the manuscript, and what had happened is in the transcript they had added some little space had come up between those two, so it was actually one word. So it was dulce, and dulce is again there's another translation, and the other translation had translated as a bucket, right? And this is we're gonna get a little R-rated here. No one under 16 here, right? So there's one part that he's talking about is wet nurse, and he says, I don't know what it was about this woman, what tie she had to me, that she cared so much about my life, and all she had done was she got paid to stuff her black shriveled nipples into my cheek like a bucket. It's like a bucket? Dulce in more Indian usage, right? Is a bucket. And I'm like, that does not make any sense. So dulce, the che at the end of the word is the diminutive, right? And dul is a penis. So, but it's a way. So basically, he was saying she had been paid to stuff her, black shriveled nipple into my cheek like a little penis, right? And that was one of the words. Sorry, you want an example?
A graphic one.
A graphic one. Owl.
Owl. What is that? Can you see the relationship between the title and the book?
Sure,
Could
yes,
you
yeah.
tell us?
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me see if I have it. I must have it somewhere.
Right, so the story continues, and our character, just as it continues, you can see him completely deteriorate mentally, right? And right before the final sequence, so throughout the whole book, by the way, he has been he's been interacting with his own shadows on the wall. Towards the end of the book, he looks at his shadow that's on the wall, and he says it looked like an owl, right? An owl in Iranian literature is a bad omen. It's a bad omen. It's a sign of decay. So he sees the owl. He sees himself as an owl, and then so it's the shadow of an owl, right? And then the whole blindness is like, why is the owl blind, right? The owl is nocturnal, right? So you usually don't see owls during the day. So the fact that there's a light shining on the owl to make a shadow on the wall, that would make the owl blind. So he identifies with the shadow of the owl, right? And again, for this I'm speculating, right? But that's why I think it's called Blind Owl. It initiates the final sequence of the book.
How did you decide to translate?
Blind Owl? I hate beating up on other translators. The other translation was horrible. It was translated in the 1950s by someone who actually had translated the French translation. Did a little bit of research into that, and then we teach this book. We've been teaching it for years before my translation. And when you read it, it's a very different voice you get from the narrator from the old Costello translation. The translation is he makes the narrator into an intellectual character, right? It's almost as if he is kind of imposing his own interpretation of this weird French Saftian, ethos on this character. So the voice of the character is completely wrong, right? And we had a hard time, and people who read the other translation were just very often just confused by it, right? And the translation goes wrong right from the first sentence. But he translates what is soul, ruh, is the soul, right? He translates as the mind. So right from that first sentence, the book just completely goes in a different direction. So it was, I'm happy to say this, I did this for my students.
And our production at BU, we did with
That's right, with our wonderful director here,
Yes.
who did a theatrical production of Blind Owl. And we used the old Costello translation, and we realized something needs to be done. So
Wanna do that again,
that's
yeah.
right. So I started translating little bits and pieces, just kind of for our project, and then it's okay. No, you need the whole thing.
Thank you for a great reading, beautiful. And if I may suggest you turn it into an audible too, because you're going to be selling quite a bit.
It is. Actually, it is. There is an audiobook for it.
So here's my question. Did Hedayat himself ever reflect on his books after they were published?
Oh, I really don't know.
No
To be
interview.
honest with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he died very young,
Yeah.
right? He died very young, and by most accounts, he was a real recluse. So, didn't have that much interaction with people. So as far as I know, I don't know.
So no records.
Not that I know.
Is the book printed in Iran
it
You-
was never printed in Iran?
It was censored, and then it was completely banned. So, yes, the source is Amazon.
So you can't find, if you wanted to buy this in Iran, you can't find it.
No, you can, everyone reads it.
Yeah, everyone, you can find it, but I don't think
You'll find it on.
Black mark.
Yes.
black market.
It was a question
Yeah,
there.
Victor had it.
Yeah. Oh.
Early in your remarks, your reading, I think you used the term surreal.
Mhm.
I perhaps inappropriately had an association with a poem by Wallace Stevens. Reality is an activity of the most august imagination. Could you play with, as you did some years ago with me, to what is imagination responsible?
Well, the imagination here, I mean, we can go in two very different directions with the imagination, right? We can go with the imagination the way the English Romantic poets take it, right? It's Wordsworth sitting on the couch and, remembering a particular scene, that kind of,
The daffodils.
The daffodils, that's right. It's like, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils, right? That solitude that he feels, it is the imagination that fills that solitude for him. But then we have someone like this, and that imagination is what takes him in a very, very odd direction. And you really put your finger on it, because there's so much here that I didn't read for you. And a lot of it is just his imagination, right? So he imagines that his unfaithful wife, which again, we have we have a narrator we can't really trust, right? Who thinks that the wife is unfaithful, and then ultimately thinks that she is having an affair with that most disgusting character in this book, who is the peddler, right? To the point where he imagines he sees his teeth mark on her lips and on her cheek, right? So the imagination can go in two very different directions, right? It's, again, there's that Wordsworthian imagination that kind of elevates the solitary individual. And then there's this guy's imagination, right? Opium-induced imagination, that it's almost as if he's kind of spiraling down, right, into Dante's Inferno. Deeper and deeper he goes as the story continues.
There's a question here.
I have a question about the process of translation. So I know that you did the very best
Best I could do.
that you could do the translation from Persian to English. But I'm just curious, was there ever certain sentences or certain paragraphs or certain ideas that you just felt that there's just no way that you can translate? Like when you're reading in English now, you're reading the book in English. Were there parts of the Persian book that you just felt couldn't translate because there aren't words, to express that? I mean,
There's always ways around, right? You hit a roadblock, what do? You put it aside. You put it aside, you come back to it, right? So I have so many different drafts of my translation, and parts of it that I read, I'm like, oh, this is just absolutely horrible, right? But you will find your way, right? It's like being a mouse and being dropped into a box. And it's like, well, there's one hole, you better find your way out, right? You might have to, I don't know, you might have to improvise, you might have to really just do whatever it takes, right? There were very difficult parts. There are vocabulary that doesn't translate, right? That's the case with translating between any language, really, right? There are specific vocabulary that doesn't have the equivalent. I try to do my best
right? Without having to resort to footnotes, right? That's one thing I really do like. So this is what we always talk about. Translation is just, it's an exercise in failure, right? Regardless of what it is. So we're just trying to reduce the degree of failure. And if it reads okay, then I'm happy. You're the narrator.
Okay, so Sassan, I have one question for you about the translation. It's just the opposite of the question that was asked, which is to what extent, because as someone who's sometimes reading works in translation, trying to teach my students and all that, I'm furious with the translation. To what extent do you feel that being immersed in the culture is equally important to knowledge and the language, from the language you're translating to the language you're translating to? So, to what extent do you steep yourself in the culture, the literature, for you to be able to do this work?
Oh, I think it's very important. It's very important.
Shortest question to the longest, shortest answer to the longest question.
It's very important. I feel lucky in a way. So Persian is my mother language, but I feel like English is my first language, right? So I'm translating from my mother language into my first language, which is usually doesn't happen, right? But yeah, the cultural things is, you have to be able to kind of, you grow up breathing the rhythms of a particular language, right? So I remember it's kind of always been the case that even reading Persian poetry, I'm reading it in Persian, but I sometimes hear it in my head in English. So yeah, and then the cultural things, naturally, right? It's and it's not just the technical terms that come up, right? It's a particular feel that you get by knowing the culture well, and yeah, it's the kind of things that you don't learn in school, you don't learn in books, you learn it at home, right? And that is invaluable.
A couple, I think did you?
No, I had the same question.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I just had a few comments about the teacher. Right?
Teacher.
But yeah, because I remember when I was in high school, we had to use this text that had the vocabulary. And of course, you all thought about the bad part of it. But it actually is a bucket that has a handle and also it's like a teapot. So when you pour out of it, it's not like an open bucket. It has a
Spout.
yes, spout.
Yeah.
So and maybe you're just talking about eating here like with the spout, but I don't think it has anything to do with the sexual part.
It's talking about context. So that word taken out of just by itself, out of context, is it could very well do that. But if within the context of the passage it comes in, there's an entire sense of like sexual reversal, right? Where the wet nurse, where he has become, as a kid, he has become the woman, and she has become the man. So within that context, it was, unfortunately, I had to go with the more unsavory piece.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask, following up on our question, do you remember any examples of those concepts in Persian that were hard to translate to English, and like how did you go about that? Well, as someone that has seen your translations, I can testify that you're really awesome in the way you do it. But yeah, I just wondered if you remember any examples of like really like Persian concepts that are or states or ideas or feelings,
Sure.
that are hard.
There was a lot of things about, I don't remember the exact words, but there's a lot of different foods come up, right? A lot of different senses come up. A lot of, I don't know,
zoholachte, things like that, all kinds of weird things come up, right? Where he overhears the peddler in the street saying, or something like that, right? And it's like, what is that? It's like, it's like, okay, it helps cool your liver or kidney, right? So there was a lot of things like that, so, yeah, it's. Is it something like, get your blackberries? Again, I don't remember. Something like, get your blackberries here. It helps cool your liver, or something like that. Yeah. Right, short or
just kind of going off of the culture immersion, the importance of that in the translation. Was there any difficulty, given the French influence that we have, that you previously mentioned? Did that play a role in the translation while you're making it, or no? In terms of like the influence, if that played any influence on it?
No, I don't think so. What I did was I tried not to, believe it or not, I tried not to do too much research, right? I took the work, took the text on its own, right? To look too deeply into something, right, is going to affect the way you're translating it. So I just wanted to deal with nothing but the words on the page, So.
Well, we're happy you retained your sanity after translating.
That's what you think.
And we should bring this to a close. Thank you so much.
We are a little over time, but thank you so much for deeply engaging with the event with your questions. I really appreciate it. We are going to have a signing. We're going to have you line up this way and down there. Try to keep you out of the store a little bit.